Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of our four-part webinar series on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the concluding observations for Canada. My name is Karen Campbell, and I'm with the Canadian Women's Foundation. We are so pleased to be co-hosting this webinar series today with the amazing women at FAFIA, and we're delighted that so many of you are able to join us on this session. It looks like we have about 45 or so folks on the line so far, and anticipating that that others will be joining as well from across the country. And this wide participation really signals for us that community-based organizations, activists, and frontline practitioners in Canada are interested in these international processes and how they influence Canadian policy. After the incredible turnout for the women's marches across the world, we know it's really an important time for us to be talking about and organizing to advocate for women's rights and also for all human rights in any way that we can. So before we get started, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping items with you. First of all, on the right-hand panel of your screen of the GoToWebinar application, you're going to see a box where you can type questions. Please use this box if you have any questions that you'd like to ask the presenters, or if you have any difficulties with the technology. On the line with us today are my colleagues Beth Malcolm and Keitha Mercer, and between the three of us we're going to try to address any technological concerns that you have, and we'll also be moderating questions for the presenters as well. So please use this box to signal to it also if the presenters are moving too quickly through the content so that we can ask them to adjust their speed. The second piece is that in your panel you'll also see a section with some handouts that you can download for your reference. There are two handouts and a PDF copy of the presentation slides, so you can use those as resources and to refer back after the webinar. Thirdly, this session is being recorded. We will share the recording of with all of the participants who are on the line with us today and everybody who's on our email list once this webinar is over. Today we're going to talk about the most recent concluding observations that were released by the CEDAW Committee. Canada was reviewed by this committee in October of 2016, and its recommendations were released in November of 2016. And this webinar series is meant to introduce you to the CEDAW Committee, to discuss the procedure of the periodic review process, and to highlight some of the concluding observations and how you can use them to actually do your own advocacy for women's rights in Canada. We hope that after this webinar, you'll be interested in working with the CEDAW Committee's recommendations to Canada or engaging in the next periodic review. As you know, this is a four-part webinar series that we've scheduled between now and the end of April. Registration for each session will be opened about 2 weeks in advance, and due to the very high demand for participation, we recommend that you register as quickly as possible. If you have colleagues who want to join these sessions and you're working in the same office, you could also try just registering one person and then having like a shared computer to view the session to accommodate the widest participation possible. So before we get started, we thought that we would do a quick survey of those who are on the line. So we'd like to know how many of you have actually heard about CEDAW, the convention, before you joined us. So you should be able to participate. Looks like folks are clicking in with their answers. Great. All right, so as you can see, it looks like about 65% of folks who are on the call with us do know about CEDAW at least a little bit already, and 35% are newcomers to this. So that's a really good starting point, I think, for our presenters for this discussion. And with that, I'll introduce our speakers today, Lara and Susie. Lara is a steering committee member of the Canadian Feminist Alliance for International Action. She's involved in FAFIA's women's rights reporting to UN treaty bodies and in FAFIA's domestic initiatives through the Campaign of Solidarity with Aboriginal Women and the forthcoming Step Up for Women's Equality campaign. Lara is in her final year of law school at the University of Toronto. She has a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in international human rights law. She has worked with human rights organizations in Canada and the United States, including Justice for Girls, Human Rights Watch, West Coast Leaf, and Physicians for Human Rights. And her co-presenter is Susie Dunn, who is the coordinator for the Canadian Feminist Alliance for International Action. She was called to the Ontario Bar in 2016 and is currently a Master's of Law candidate at the University of Ottawa. She's as a research fellow with the Equality Project. She examines how law and policy can help create equality-enhancing spaces for young people online, with a focus on preventing technologically facilitated violence against girls and other marginalized youth. Prior to attending law school, Susie worked as a frontline worker supporting victims of intimate partner violence and sexualized violence, and she also worked with Northern Youth, helping to fulfill their equality rights. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Laura and oops, sorry, I just made a mistake here on my tech side. 1 second. I'm going to turn things over to Laura and to Susie to take us through their presentations. Okay, you can go ahead, Laura.
Oh, hi, it's actually Susie who's going to start off. Can you hear me all right? Today we're going to be covering several topics. We'll begin with an introduction to the convention, and following that we're going to go over a short history of CEDAW, and then we'll discuss who engages with the CEDAW Committee, and we'll talk about the process of what a periodic review looks like. Then, using Canada's most recent review process, we'll go over what CEDAW's list of issues were for this year. We'll discuss Canada's reply to the CEDAW Committee, and we'll go over what civil society reports are and what they're used for. Then we'll provide a few examples of the reports that FAFIA submitted to the CEDAW Committee in October, and we'll go over some examples of recommendations from the 2016 concluding observations. Finally, we're going to discuss how organizations and individuals interested in women's rights can use the CEDAW reports and recommendations to advocate for women's rights. And there will be some time at the end of the session for questions and answers. So for the time being, just save your questions until the end. So on the next slide, we're going to go over an introduction of CEDAW. So CEDAW stands for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which we refer to as CEDAW. So CEDAW is one of the core international human rights treaties of the United Nations, and it sets out the international standards for the recognition and protection of women's fundamental rights, including women's civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights. And Canada's ratified CEDAW. And what ratification means is that member states of the United Nations can sign and ratify human rights treaties. And once a member state has ratified a treaty such as CEDAW, it doesn't automatically become binding or enforceable law in Canada. Each country has its own procedure for how international law is incorporated into domestic law. And in Canada, there's no automatic application of an international treaty once it's been ratified. So with CEDAW, it's not a form of domestic law that's enforceable in the Canadian courts, but instead, Canada meets its human rights obligations under CEDAW by incorporating aspects of international law into either domestic legislation or by enacting policies and programs that comply with CEDAW's international women's rights standards. And when we talk about the convention, we'll call it either CEDAW or the convention. But CEDAW also has a committee that's made up of a group of human rights experts that monitor state compliance with CEDAW. And so we'll refer to that group as the CEDAW Committee. The CEDAW Committee is a monitoring body that's made up of 23 women's rights experts, and these experts are elected to their positions every 2 years, and they can be re-elected for more terms after that. And the members of the committee review the country's compliance with CEDAW about every 4 years. But they can also come into a country to investigate grave violations of women's rights. But typically, the committee works on monitoring whether and how states comply with the standards that are set out in CEDAW. So Canada's most recent CEDAW review was in the fall of 2016, but prior to that, it was reviewed in 2008, 2003, and also 1997. And as part of the periodic review process, the committee will make recommendations to Canada about how it can change its domestic policy to better ensure women's equalities. And so women's organizations like FAFIA use the international standards that are set out in CEDAW, as well as the recommendations they make at each review, to advocate for the advancement of women's rights in Canada. And some of the rights that CEDAW protects include a women's right to equal pay, comprehensive health care, employment opportunities, and reproductive choice, just to name a few. CEDAW also has an optional protocol that countries can ratify, and the optional protocol is a separate treaty that allows individuals or groups to make complaints to the committee if there's been a grave or systemic violation of their CEDAW protected rights. And once that complaint's made, the CEDAW committee can decide whether to undertake an inquiry about the complaint. In 2008, FAFIA and the Native Women's Association of Canada requested that the CEDAW committee initiate an inquiry into missing and disappeared Indigenous women and girls under Article 8 of the optional protocol. And our complaint led to an investigation in Canada in 2013 by the committee. And by 2015, the committee had made 38 recommendations, including calling on Canada to launch an inquiry into missing and disappeared Indigenous women and girls. And this report was really groundbreaking. It was the first time that Canada had been found to violate Indigenous women's rights protected under CEDAW. So it was a really important complaint and report. So on the next slide, I'll talk about the history of CEDAW. So before CEDAW was adopted by the UN, women had been advocating to have an international treaty that would enshrine women's rights for decades. And this work finally came together, and CEDAW was adopted in 1979. And it was really interesting because it was the fastest treaty in the UN's history to come into force. It only took about 2 years to enter into force, and Canada signed on fairly quickly after that. It ratified CEDAW in 1981. And then as of 2016, nearly every country in the world has ratified or acceded to CEDAW, and so it's a very well-received treaty in the UN. And Laura, I'll pass it on to you.
Okay, hi everybody. So there are three important actors in the CEDAW Committee periodic review process: the CEDAW Committee, the state being reviewed, or the country being reviewed, and contributing civil society actors. So first, the country. The country being reviewed has a number of obligations. It must submit a report on the status of women's rights in its country, exemplifying how the state is meeting its obligations under CEDAW. This generally happens well before the review. So for example, Canada submitted its state report to the CEDAW Committee in April 2015, well before the review actually took place in October 2016. The country then replies to the CEDAW Committee's list of issues for the review. This supplementary reply report is generally received a month or so before the actual review meetings take place. The reviewing state sends official representatives from the government to Geneva to participate in the review meetings with the committee members. For the most recent review by the CEDAW Committee, government representatives from the federal, Ontario, and Quebec governments were present in Geneva. And representatives usually consist of government political officials or civil servants who specialize in areas relevant to women's rights. Of note is that in this year, in the 2016 review, the Minister on the Status of Women did not make an appearance, which many people were hoping would occur. Second, there are civil society actors. So civil society actors include the National Human Rights Institution of the country. For Canada, that is the Canadian Human Rights Commission, as well as non-government organizations that focus on women's rights issues. These organizations also submit reports to CEDAW, sometimes called shadow reports, and those who can afford to send representatives to Geneva to advocate during the review process. It is incredibly helpful for NGOs to be present in Geneva during the review. Those who attend can speak directly with CEDAW committee members, share their perspectives in an informal NGO meeting, and really feed committee members questions to ask Canada, as well as draft recommendations to be made to Canada in the concluding observations document. NGOs truly play a critical role. At the most recent review, some organizations in attendance included FAFIA, the Native Women's Association of Canada, the Single Mothers Alliance of British Columbia, Amnesty International Canada, West Coast Legal Education and Action Fund, Canada Without Poverty, and Aboriginal Legal Services, among many more. There were 16 organizations total represented by Canadian civil society actors in Geneva in October. Lastly, the CEDAW committee members. So not all 23 members of the CEDAW committee will review each country. For our most recent review, there were a subgroup of about 10 committee members who were assigned to review Canada. Those members will closely review the government and civil society reports, ask the government and NGOs specific questions about their reports to get a better understanding of how CEDAW is actually being implemented in Canada. And then those members will draft a report, what is called the concluding observations. And this includes recommendations on how Canada can improve its compliance with CEDAW. So now we're going to do a quick poll to have a sense of how many participants in this webinar may have participated in either a CEDAW review before or any other treaty review. So if you could, are folks participating? Awesome. Okay, so for those few folks who participated, that's fantastic. This is going to be a basic review for you. And then for the many people who are participating in the webinar today, I will be going through just the basics of what a treaty review process entails. Okay, so back to the slides. So the treaty review process, it's a fluid process. We have disassembled it into about 9 stages here, just for the purposes of learning, and we'll be using the Canadian context and our most recent review by the CEDAW Committee to explain these stages. So first, the committee informs Canada in advance when it will be reviewed. There's lots of notice. So for example, in the concluding observations from the 2016 review, towards the end of the document, right, the committee says Canada should expect to be reviewed again in 2020. So there are years of notice for a country to prepare for its next periodic review. There will also be other communications conveyed to the country, including when it's expected to submit its report to the treaty body. Second, there's a pre-sessional working group meeting where the CEDAW committee members make a list of issues that they will focus on during the review. For NGOs, this is one of the most important documents you'll want to look at. The list of issue documents document sets out the key issues that the committee is going to focus on during the review. Typically, all UN documents related to treaty review processes will be published on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights website, so the public can easily access them. And you, for example, can go right now to the Office of the High Commissioner's website and access all the documents that were part of the CEDAW Committee's review of Canada in October. So third, the Government of Canada will write a reply report to CEDAW based on the list of issues. So reading this report helps civil society actors to understand Canada's stance on women's rights in that present moment, given that the formal state report can be a year dated at that point, as well as it also informs civil society actors and others how the country is likely to respond, or how the state is likely to respond to the committee's list of issues during the review in Geneva. Fourth, the CEDAW review begins in Geneva. So Canada's most current review occurred during 2 formal meetings that were held on Tuesday, October 25th, 2016. Usually country review meetings are staggered, so the first meeting will happen on one day, the second meeting will happen on another day. For Canada, with the CEDAW Committee this year, it happened all on one day. Fifth, prior to the formal sessions or meetings between the committee and the Canadian government representatives, the committee members meet with civil society actors, so mostly NGOs. And this is where we can talk with committee members about our issues. The committee members ask us questions and we have an opportunity to answer them directly. We can also provide additional written information via email and really strike a rapport with community members during that time. So for the CEDAW Committee reviews, there are 2 NGO meetings with the committee. So first, a lunchtime briefing, which is an informal briefing, and this is an hour-long question and answer session, followed by a more formal NGO session, where all of the NGOs, all the Canadian NGOs present, together present a 10-minute oral statement about their collective issues, and then answer any follow-up questions the committee might have. This work really requires a lot of preparation on the part of the NGOs who are participating in the review. At our last review, we spent many hours writing a collective compilation document and oral statement that we could all agree on, and that encompassed all our perspectives and issues. Following our presentation, our oral statement, the committee asked questions about particular issues, and at that point, Canadian civil society actors responded. Civil society actors can follow up with committee members at meeting breaks to talk about issues or to appeal to committee members to press an issue further. So there are other opportunities to engage with committee members outside the informal and formal meetings. Some members are particularly interested in certain issues, and it is often exceedingly helpful to speak with them directly and provide additional information. And one will have a sense of which committee members are interested in which issues based on their questions. Speaking with the committee members ultimately influences what is in the concluding observations. So having people in Geneva really makes a real difference. So sixth, the day of the formal review of Canada begins. So both the chair of the CEDAW Committee and chair of the delegation from Canada make opening statements to open the formal review meetings. Then a question and answer period begins, where committee members ask questions of Canada related to the list of issues, and those issues raised by civil society actors in the previous meetings. The government then has an opportunity to respond to the questions. Seventh, Canada can submit a follow-up submissions on any questions they decide not to answer during the question and answer period of the meeting. So eighth, a few weeks after the review concludes, the CEDAW committee members release their concluding observations of the review of Canada, which includes recommendations to Canada on how Canada can improve its compliance with its obligations under CEDAW. And then lastly, Canada has the opportunity to actually implement these recommendations, which is something ultimately that we want Canada to do. And this is what NGOs advocate for and what FAFIA is currently working on.
Great, thanks for that summary, Laura. So I'm going to go over a few of the documents in a bit more detail. And the handout that was attached to the webinar, it actually has links to all of the different documents. So if you want to see what the concluding observations look like or what the list of issues actually looks like, all of those documents should have a hyperlink in the first handout that we sent out. So we're going to talk about the list of issues. And as Laura said before, this is probably the most important document for NGOs to read over if you're going to prepare a report to send into CEDAW. It's essentially a list of everything that the committee has decided is an essential issue. And so typically when NGOs are reporting, they'll look at this list of issues and find ones that are relevant to the women that they work with, and they'll report on some or all of the issues. But you're not limited just to these issues. If there's a glaring gap in the list of issues, you can bring something up in your report so that the committee knows about it. But typically, you'll follow this list of issues, and so it's released on the UN's website, and it has general topic headings. You can see the list of the ones that were provided for this year. And so they'll have the topic heading, and then they'll have more detailed questions and information about those topics that they'd like to know about. So for this review, there was a lot of interest in access to justice, Indigenous women, health, refugee women. And so different NGOs read over this list prior to setting up their reports and sending in their reports to understand what the issues were for this review. And all of the issues are generally tied back to a specific article in the CEDAW Convention. So if you read the CEDAW Convention, for example, Article 10 addresses women's general rights to equal education opportunities, but then some other issues like access to justice don't necessarily link back to one article, but are linked back to several articles. And then some of the list of issues don't cover all topics. So for example, women's poverty isn't listed on the list, but for our organization, FAFIA, and many others, we still thought poverty was a really important issue, and so we reported on it anyways. And so on the next slide, I've got a screenshot of what the Canada's reply to CEDAW looks like. And so after the list of issues has been released, the Canadian government then provides a reply to all of these issues. And so it sends this to the committee, and it'll note the specific legislation, judicial decisions, policies and programs in Canada that they've been implementing to improve the rights of women, to show how they've been complying with CEDAW. And so for NGOs, this can be a really great report also to read over, because again, as Laura said before, this outlines what Canada's position is going to be, and it helps you understand how best to provide additional information that you felt either needed to be brought up to the committee or to respond to some of the positions that Canada has had about how they're implementing women's programs and policies. And so if you identify any issues that have been missed out or need to be fleshed out, then you have an opportunity to add that into your report that you submit to CEDAW.
Sorry to interrupt, Laura. I just have a question from someone asking if you could elaborate a little bit on what you mean by national machinery.
Can we save questions until the end?
Yep, sure.
Great. Laura, on to you.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Apologies. I was muted. I've been talking to myself for the last couple minutes. So civil society reports are where we come in ultimately. So any NGO that has registered with the United Nations and has ECOSOC status can submit a report during a treaty review. Reports are submitted at least 3 weeks before the start of the review session, and there is a formal NGO note that is circulated by the committee that outline how NGOs are supposed to submit their report, so it's easily publicly accessible. Most civil society actors who report are women's or human rights organizations, but community-based groups, faith-based groups, unions, service providers, social movements, and others are considered civil society actors as well, and they can come together in a submission. At the most recent review, a variety of feminist, women's, and human rights organizations submitted reports. Some groups were national women's organizations with specific focuses, such as the Native Women's Association of Canada and FAFIA. Others were larger international human rights organizations, such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and others were more frontline service providers, such as Aboriginal Legal Services. Some groups also submit joint reports. This allows organizations to pool their knowledge into one report and ensure that what is being reported on reflects leading expertise and frontline experience in Canada. Without civil society reports, CEDAW committee members would only hear from government. And our civil society expertise and grassroots knowledge is ultimately essential for the committee to make recommendations that are relevant to Canadian women and grounded in the lived experiences of women in Canada. So regardless of the size and scope of your organization, you can submit a report to the committee, or you can reach out to organizations such as FAFIA or Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, other organizations, and state your interest and your area of expertise and what you would want to submit to the CEDAW committee. So once reports are submitted, committee members will consider them. Ultimately, the best thing to do upon submitting a report is to send someone to Geneva to engage in oral advocacy with committee members. This ensures that your issues will be considered and will likely lead your issues to being formulated as questions to Canada. This is really essential because the committee can only make concluding observations on those issues that were raised as questions to Canada. So you want your questions to be posed by committee members to Canadian state delegates. In Geneva, the civil society representatives who are there work together to create a joint oral statement that is presented to the CEDAW committee. It is a short and concise summary of the leading women's rights issues in Canada. Sometimes the representatives will make a compilation report that summarizes all of the issues raised by civil society during a review. This provides a useful reference for committee members who may not be able to read every civil society report individually. At the most recent review, the collective oral presentation was limited to 15 minutes. This can be a challenge, but we managed to pull it together and condense all of our materials into 15 minutes, and 5 women from different organizations present presented the statement to the committee. So FAFIA, okay, so FAFIA presented 4 separate reports for this review, 1 independently and 3 in collaboration with other women's organizations. Various women, including advocates, academics, students, and alliance members, helped research and prepare these reports. You can find links to them in the handout provided. Our first report what we submitted on our own. So it covered many of the issues set out in the list of issues. For organizations like FAFIA, we're a national women's organization and we advocate on a wide variety of women's rights issues. So we worked hard to ensure that our general report would cover issues that would likely not be covered by others. So for example, like constitutional legislative issues, national machinery issues, and access to justice. But for organizations with a more specific mandate, they generally only report on 1 or 2 issues. So for example, Canada Without Poverty, their submission is generally on poverty and issues related to poverty. The other 3 reports FAFIA submitted were in collaboration with other groups who specialize in specific issue areas. We submitted 1 report with the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies and the Chair of Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University on socioeconomic conditions of Indigenous women and girls and women in detention, including the overuse of administrative segregation. Another joint report was with the Canadian Association of Sexual Assault Centres on violence against women. And a 3rd joint report was with the Native Women's Association of Canada on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So working in tandem with these organizations allowed us to rely on each other's expertise and strengthen our professional relationships and role as allies in the advancement of women's rights in Canada. It is an excellent exercise in collaborative advocacy and also shares the load because oftentimes this is volunteer work by women and who are doing it off the sides of their desks. So when you are writing a report, it's always useful to include a description of the issue that you're responding to note any past recommendations the CEDAW committee has made on the subject, as well as include suggested questions the committee can pose to Canada and sample recommendations the committee can make to Canada in its concluding observations. Civil society actors in Canada have the technical expertise and first-hand experience with the issues raised by the CEDAW committee. As such, the committee really relies upon civil society questions to and recommendations for Canada. While the committee members may not use suggested questions and recommendations verbatim, they heavily rely upon them.
So after the formal review is over in Geneva, the committee members take the information they got from Canada's report, the NGO's report, and then the time that they had asking questions to civil society members and the government, and they compile that information into a report with their concluding observations. And so this report comes out fairly quickly after the review, probably only a few weeks after everything's wrapped up in Geneva. And it's released on the last day of the committee session. So the concluding observations usually start off with positive developments in women's rights implementation in Canada since the country's last review. So, for example, in the last review, it would point out positive movements that Canada had made, such as like the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. But the bulk of the report and what we're actually most interested in are the recommendations to Canada about how Canada can improve its compliance with CEDAW. These recommendations are a list of what Canada should be doing to improve the realization of women's rights in Canada. And as NGOs, we can use these recommendations to really push Canada to follow through with its commitment to gender equality as a signatory to CEDAW. So next slide, you'll see a few examples of some of the concluding observation recommendations. There's dozens of these recommendations. We picked these three out to highlight just because they're topics that we'll be covering in our next three webinars. And so in the next three webinars, we'll dig a bit deeper into what the actual concluding observation and recommendations are, focusing on specific topics. So the first recommendation that you'll see there, it calls on Canada to implement 37 recommendations made by the CEDAW Committee following the investigation they did on missing and disappeared Indigenous women and girls. That was resulting from the optional protocol complaint. And Canada's only implemented one recommendation so far, which is launching the inquiry. And so they recommend that they follow through with the other 37 as well. The second concluding observation recommendation on the slide calls for an increase in civil legal aid. And that's really important because women dominate that area of legal aid, and they need more access to it. And the UN recognizes that and has recommended that Canada increase that. And we'll be talking about civil legal aid and also incarceration in our second webinar. And the third recommendation calls for a national poverty reduction strategy, as well as a national housing strategy that protects the rights of all women. So in the next three webinars, we'll go into more detail about the recommendations and what people are doing to advocate on those. On the next slide, I just wanted to point out two more interesting recommendations that we found really important. These two are interesting because they really call for systemic change. So the first recommendation that you can read there, it calls for the development of a comprehensive national gender action plan that addresses women's structural inequality. And you can see on the list there, it covers a wide variety of women, who need to be taken into consideration when thinking of a national gender action plan. And we thought it was a really good recommendation. The second recommendation recommends that Canada reinforce monitoring mechanisms that assess gender equality policies, plans, and programs, which again is another one that's calling for systemic change. And so these are just a few examples of dozens of recommendations that were put out in the concluding observation. And again, if you go to your handout, you can open up the concluding observation and read through all of them if you're interested, and then also follow up with our next webinars. Laura, I'll pass it on to you.
Awesome. So the concluding observations can be used as education or advocacy tools for local, provincial, territorial, and national organizations advocating for the domestic implementation of women's rights. But they can also be used to advocate for the protection of women's rights in other countries. And at the most recent review, there was a submission on human rights violations by Canadian mining companies abroad. And the report was focused on human rights violations against women who are citizens of other countries, but who are subject to these violations due to the actions of Canadian companies. So a Guatemalan woman attended the CEDAW session in Geneva in October to report on the violations that she and other women experienced in Guatemala due to the operations of Canadian mining companies. And this year, the committee recommended that Canada address the violation of women's rights that stem from the activities of Canadian companies abroad. And this is a really important development because generally only women from the country go to advocate when their country is being reviewed. And the fact that there was a Guatemalan woman at the Canada's review was really pushing the committee to recognize that countries have extraterritorial obligations. Okay. So education and advocacy campaigns. Once the concluding observations have been released, as they have, the domestic implementation work begins. So, you know, it's ultimately in many ways up to civil society and the government to decide what we're going to do with the concluding observations, if we're actually going to work towards implementing them or we're just going to let them sit on a shelf. So to make sure that the recommendations are implemented, NGOs must advocate for their implementation and educate people about them. We can do this through social media campaigns, through press conferences, solidarity campaigns, such as FAFIA's Step Up for Women's Equality campaign, which we're launching on February 1st, and by engaging with politicians and speaking with members of parliament and members of provincial parliament. So solidarity campaigns such as the Step Up for Women's Equality campaign can be used to disseminate reports and related information about CEDAW. This can be done at an individual or an organizational level as well. And the more women who are informed, the stronger our movement is. So FAFIA, we have drafted a call to action letter to the Prime Minister and actually to a number of federal ministers now, asking them to implement the CEDAW recommendations, and in particular to work on a national gender equality plan, as well as an implementation mechanism that can ensure that the treaty body recommendations, such as CEDAW Committee recommendations, are actually monitored and acted upon by government. At this point, over 100 organizations and individuals have signed on to this letter, and we're really thrilled and excited by the overwhelming support and are, you know, really pumped to launch the Step Up for Women's Equality campaign on February 1st.
So that's the summary of what the CEDAW process looks like and what happened in the most recent 2016 CEDAW review, along with some examples of the advocacy that we're going to be working on and opportunities for you to participate in as well. And so it looks like we have about 15 minutes left for questions and answers. And so at this time, we can start answering questions, and you can submit them. There's a dialog box to the right where you should be able to submit questions, and we'll get them via the program, and we'll be able to answer them. So we'll read them out loud, and then we'll answer the questions. So feel free to start typing in any questions you have, and we'd be happy to answer them.
Awesome, and I'll just start off by responding to the question about what national machinery refers to. And so national machinery is defined by the committee actually in General Recommendation number 6 in 1988. And it really just refers to sort of institutional mechanisms like gender-based policies, gender mainstreaming, like interministerial committees, or like series of meetings, like those types of processes that happen at a very high level, sort of federal level. It can also refer to processes that happen at the provincial territorial level, but it's all related to the institutional structure of government and how it does or does not respond to women's issues, right? So if there's awareness around women's issues and how law and policy can actually be impacting women and girls differently, and this is sort of summarized through gender-based analysis. So if you have downloaded the concluding observations, at paragraph 20 and 21, the committee deals with national machinery for the advancement of women and gender mainstreaming in Canada. And it highlights the absence of a comprehensive national gender equality strategy in Canada, the absence of gender equality policy, or an action plan to address structural factors that cause persistent gender inequalities. It also highlights the fact that Indigenous women's organizations, so NWAC in particular, is not included in the national nation-to-nation relationship on equal footing with other Indigenous organizations. So as you can see by that as an example, right, the national machinery sort of umbrella topic really allows the committee to go into some detail and to call out government on things such as NWAC not being at the table alongside the AFN and other national Aboriginal organizations in Canada. It also highlights under national machinery the fact that 12 out of the 16 Status of Women Canada regional offices closed in the last 10 years when under a number of Harbour Conservative governments, and that since that time there's been no movement to reinstate those offices. So with, you know, by pointing out that issue, the committee is also highlighting sort of the regional nature of sort of women's rights awareness and compliance, and what different regional offices are or are not doing to advance women's rights issues in the more regional context, as women's needs in the north and more rural areas, for example, are very different from women's needs in the urban Southern Ontario context, for example.
So we have another question, and just to let people know, if you'd like to answer your question or ask your question out loud, just raise your hand and we would be more than happy to give you control of your mic so you can say it. The next question we have is from a person named Barbara Cameron, and the question is, the government and NGO reports are presented as parallel streams. Is there a possibility of some sort of NGO and government's collaboration during the preparation of the report and the implementation of the committee's recommendations?
Generally, they're separate reports. The government does do theirs quite independently, and as far as I know, and Laura, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe that there is a lot of NGO input when they're creating the reports, and vice versa. I don't think that there was communication with the government when we were creating our reports, at least on FAFIA's behalf.
No, that's correct. So when a state is actually drafting its report, it's reporting on government programs, policies, initiatives. So the government at that point in time doesn't reach out to civil society actors, and civil society actors, we don't reach out to government at that time either. We prepare our reports separately. However, there is communication between civil society actors and the government representatives who are active on this file about the sort of types of things we're reporting on. So for example, there was a meeting that was held in, I think it was late September, either late September or early October now. I think it was late September. And it was a day-long meeting. Those who could attend in Ottawa attended. Others, such as myself, I was in Calgary. I called in by teleconference. And during that time, there was a dialogue between government and civil society actors participating in the review. And at that point, we were able to have a sense of what the government was preparing in its reply report and how it planned to respond to the list of issues. And likewise, we had the opportunity then to ask particular questions of government, and they asked questions of us. They were very curious to know what issues we were going to be putting sort of emphasis on in our submissions, because oftentimes what the civil society actors really impress upon the committee members, those issues and those perspectives tend to then get questioned to government during the formal review meetings. So there is often some dialogue between civil society actors and government, but not around report preparation, more just around sort of general perspectives and responses and what issue areas are going to be the focus for different groups. And in regards to implementation, Barbara, thank you for raising that. Implementation is really reliant upon civil society and government working together. Ultimately, a lot of these changes involve change to government law, policy, and programs, and we can't do that without government being on side and understanding the importance and actually moving for substantive change. So our hope is to start increasingly engaging with government about implementing the recommendations. We are going to be launching this campaign February 1st, and we are hoping to move towards a consultation by early spring, where we can sit down with ministers and civil society actors and other government representatives and really figure out what a national gender equality plan looks like, and how the different sort of national strategies that are emerging, such as the housing strategy and the poverty strategy, how we can actually knit these together and make sure that all these initiatives understand the different gendered impacts, and also beyond that, there are different impacts upon racialized women versus women with disabilities versus single mothers, urban women versus rural women. Women are not a monolithic group. I think we can all recognize that. The recent marches, there's been a lot of really important critique on that, and so understanding the very dimensions of women's needs and how policy should hopefully respond to that in a substantively equal way.
Thanks for that. We have another question from Marissa Kokoros, and the question is the list of issues the same for every country, or is a list of issues created for every country individually?
The list of issues is focused very much on Canada, and so it'll ask general questions about some issues, but it'll ask quite precise questions about Canada. So, for example, it asks specifically about missing and murdered Indigenous women and it'll ask about particular policies that exist in Canada and if things are being done around things like shelters or legal aid. So it's very country specific. We were in Geneva with a variety of other countries, and the issues, for example, that were in Bhutan were very different than the issues in Canada, and so their list of issues was substantially different from the Canadian one, and they change for each review.
Yeah, and something of note too that we didn't mention, but civil society actors can also submit reports to the committee to inform the list of issues. So in the pre-sessional working group meeting that happens well before the review, where the committee members decide what a list of issues will be for any particular country, they do review civil society submissions. And on often organizations like Amnesty International, for example, they almost always report both to the pre-sessional working group and then to the actual committee for the full review.
Okay, that's great. And then I have another question here from Sheba. Sheba would like to know if there's a guide on the CEDAW website about how a civil society organization can collaborate to submit a report.
So I'm not aware if there's any. I mean, I imagine there must be resources available, and I could definitely, or Susie and I could look for some and pass them on, Karen, and then we could pass them to the group of participants today. But I do think that, you know, domestic processes can differ, and it really depends on who in sort of the women's rights movement in a country is mobilizing at any particular year and engaging in the treaty bodies. So for example, in the Canadian context, like the way we've done it at FAFIA, to be honest, is, you know, like by reviewing who submitted in the past. So looking back to, in preparing for the 2016 review, we looked to the 2008 review. We looked at all the organizations that submitted then, and then we reached out to ask if they were submitting again, and to have a sense of what issues they were submitting on so that we could ensure that all the issues were covered. Because with FAFIA's objective as an alliance of, you know, over 70 women's organizations, we just want to make sure that, you know, the whole variety of women's issues are on the table and are actually heard and considered by the committee. But that's a really good way of doing it. And you can really just cold email an organization and say, hey, you know, I saw you submit to CEDAW on this issue. This is the issue that my organization works on. We'd like to submit. We're curious in a joint report. I mean, that's how we did it ultimately. All of our joint reports started out with us sending a couple emails and saying, hey, you know, how about we do this joint report together? You know, FAFI now has very well established relationships with some of the organizations that we did report with, such as NWAC. But ultimately, all those relationships start with that first initial email or outreach. And of course, FAFIA, like we're so happy to have folks email and express interest in this reporting. FAFIA almost exclusively does this UN treaty reporting on women's rights issues, and we're always happy to include you know, different perspectives and experiences from different organizations and folks across Canada. But I don't know if there's one sort of national resource in Canada or a CEDAW specific resource, but we can look into it.
Yeah, if anyone's interested in the specifics of how you find out, you know, when to submit reports and the length of reports and that type of thing, you can send us an email and we can provide you that information.
Great. Okay, so we still have a couple more questions and a couple more minutes left. So this question is coming from Sarah. She would like to know if government representatives at the CEDAW review tend to take a defensive stance about their country's status of women or act more as fair advocates to women in their countries.
I think at the review, Canada's really just expressing what it's done well on and also acknowledging some of the areas where it could do some work. I found that the dialogue between the CEDAW committee and the government was very respectful, and the committee asked some challenging questions. There were times when the government just said they'd like to answer the question later, and then they submitted it in a written report. But the dialogue is fairly formal and friendly.
Yeah, and just to follow up, so most of the government representatives, they have their speaking points, and they've prepared to respond to certain issues based on their speaking points and the briefs they've received from other folks in their various ministries. So generally, it is a bit of it is scripted in that way that, you know, they will sort of read closely to a script that has been prepared for them, and oftentimes, you do have that sense that that is happening. Sometimes I'm sure they do deviate from script, but there's just general sense that they're reading from a binder. That being said, Canada now, I think in the last year and a bit, is very willing to accept that there are some serious problems and women's rights violations that are occurring in Canada, particular rights violations against Indigenous women and girls. And at this particular review, INAC representatives present were very forthright, saying, we have a crisis of violence in Canada. We're working to respond to this violence. We have a national inquiry. So it wasn't as if Canada was resisting on all matters. In some ways, they were very forthright. However, in other ways, they weren't. So, for example, there was a question on the issue of solitary confinement and administrative segregation. And as we know, that's been what has been in the news, is that Canada has a policy of indefinite administrative segregation. Like under various numbers of circumstances, and that can actually be construed as solitary confinement under international law, which has been recognized in some cases to be cruel, degrading treatment that may ultimately be forms of torture. And there was a very pointed question asked of Canada, and the response was interesting because the government representative was clearly uncomfortable and was ultimately defending Canada's policy on administrative segregation, which has really been criticized by the Arbor Commission, by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, by the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and yet there we had government in 2016, standing by this ultimately a solitary confinement policy that Canada still allows for. And that was really the only instance where it felt like the government was just not being truthful and honest and fessing up to this critical rights violation. And in conversation with the committee member after, she said, really, Canada's ultimately, you're a great country, you're very lucky women. That's sort of what she said to us, happily smiling. She said, except that solitary confinement question. She's like, you know it when you see it. And these committee members, they do this process so often with so many different countries and so many different government officials, they can read government reps pretty well. So they have a pretty clear understanding when, the government is trying to cover itself up in some way or fudging answers.
Great. And we're going to just take one last question here. Mia would like to know what teeth there are in the event that a nation doesn't respond. So if, for example, Canada chooses not to act on its obligations, what kind of mechanisms are there?
Susie, do you want to go for this, or I can briefly respond? So ultimately, CEDAW is not domestically enforceable. So if Canada doesn't act on the recommendations, ultimately nothing will happen to Canada. There isn't an international police, and we can't necessarily take them to the ICJ. I mean, you could on a particular complaint, but not on the recommendations in their entirety. So where there is a very persistent rights violation and recommendations on it, so for example, the issue of violence against Indigenous women and girls, what an individual can do or organizations together can do, so for example, what FAFIA and NWAC did is we then brought forward a complaint under Article 8 of the optional protocol to CEDAW. So really the only teeth of CEDAW is in the optional protocol where there is a complaints and inquiry procedure. And there's teeth insofar as the committee will then do an inquiry process, go through an inquiry process and write, a very formal substantive report, recognizing if there are rights violations occurring. And so we have that report, and that is then a very, very useful domestic advocacy document. So for example, you will never really see a committee finding a country in violation of international law in the concluding observations. So after this review treaty process, the committee won't say, okay, like Bhutan, for example, you're violating these articles of the convention, or Canada, you're violating these articles of the convention. But that does happen in inquiry reports. So Canada was found to be in blatant violation of CEDAW and international women's rights law in 2015 by the committee. And that's really why that report is so groundbreaking, is because that's the first time we have that definitive answer from UN human rights experts in Canada. That being said, ultimately, we can't hold Canada to account, beyond just using that document for advocacy purposes, for saying you are in violation of international law, you owe women in Canada better, you have to change government of Canada. And that's what we really are trying to do with the report, and also with these concluding observations and recommendations. They build over time, and often they build on each other. So they relate to each other, and there are certain issues that haven't been resolved decade after decade. And so we have these volumes of concluding observations now to advocate with, to exemplify to Canada that we have gaps in compliance. Women's rights, we aren't able to realize the international women's rights standards that are enshrined in CEDAW. We can realize some of them in some ways, but not all of them. And we're really working towards that full realization.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lara and Susie. And thanks also to everybody for being part of the session today. As you log off, a survey is going to flash up on your screen, and we'd love it if you could take some time to provide us with your feedback on the webinar. And we'll also be sending out the link to the recording in your email in the coming days. And you have our contact information here on the screen in case you want to check out more information on the FAFIA website or email me for more information about this webinar series. So Susie, Lara, if you have any closing remarks, please go ahead.
We were so happy to have such a positive response for this webinar, and we hope that you're able to join us for the other three. They'll be much more specific and detailed, and I think you'll really enjoy them. So thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, just to echo Susie, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come learn a little bit about CEDAW and the review process. It's exciting to have so much interest, and really ultimately, if you or your organization is interested in participating in the process, don't hold back from following up with Karen, also emailing the FAFIA website or myself or Susie. We can pass those contacts on. We will not have another review by CEDAW until about 2020, but there is substantial preparation work that does go into those reviews. So it's important, if you think you do want to participate in the next review, to sort of start thinking about that and slowly slowly archiving things away that you can then put in a submission. So thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody.